Bueno, siendo exactamente...
Well, it's exactly 5 minutes after the time that was set for the seminar to begin. We would like to thank the attendants, and we will now have 5 minutes for people to join us again. So we begin here the fourth and last session of the wheat purchasing course, US Wheat 2021. Thank you once again for being here with us. And thank you for having been with us in the last 3 seminars. We had the presence of all countries in Latin America, and that makes us very happy. Once again, for you to know, this is a new virtual activity that we are creating in the office in Santiago, Chile, in order to support you, support all wheat buyers and logistics operators in Latin America, for you to be able to improve your process and your purchasing experience. The presenters this day will be Mr. Howard O'Neill, Jay O'Neill, that you all know. He is a very specialized consultant in purchasing and selling commodities. He was a professor at IGP Institute at Kansas State University in Kansas. And Osvaldo Seco will also be a presenter, the regional subdirector of the US Wheat office in Santiago, Chile. Once again, at the end of each presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and we would please ask you to keep your phones muted so you do not interfere with the presentations and we can all hear well. Once again, we would like to remind you that we have simultaneous translation into Spanish and Portuguese and English. You will find the interpretation icon in the bottom of your page, and you just have to choose between English, that is the language of the first presenter, and you can hear the presentation in Portuguese or in Spanish. When I make my presentation, I will do it in Spanish. So if you would like to hear it in Spanish, you just put it in off or in Spanish and choose English or Portuguese depending on the language that you prefer. We are in a meeting format, so you own your cameras and your microphones. Please keep them muted and you turn them on when you want to ask questions. Thank you again. Thank you to all our Latin American colleagues, all the people who speak Spanish, and our colleagues in Portuguese. I will not speak Portuguese because we are being translated. Thank you again. Thank you again, and let's begin. Jay O'Neill, you have the floor. Thank you, Jay.
Well, thank you very much, Osvaldo, and thank you to all the participants. Wonderful to be here with you again. I am going to go across and share my screen and make sure that everything is up and looking good for you. Osvaldo, is my presentation up and looking okay?
Yes. Okay, perfect, Jay.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll get going with the presentation, and I'll just start by highlighting what we are going to talk about quickly. Keep in mind, please, that back at IGP and other places where we talk about grain contracts, we spend a full day. We spend a full day seminar just talking about grain contracts because there are many important things. There are many details to be known. Now, today, of course, we have a limited time. We have just maybe an hour or a little bit more. So we can't cover all the topics about grain contracts. But what we'll try to do today is cover what I think are some of the more important, some of the more critical contract issues facing grain buyers in today's market environment. So we'll concentrate on a few key things out of the many topics that we could look at to talk about grain contracts. And then, of course, at the end, if there are some questions regarding these topics or even others that we have not covered, please feel free to ask questions, and we can certainly talk and answer questions about any topic that you wish, any topic at all related to contracts. Okay, we'll talk about contracts, and particularly today related to this COVID, difficult COVID and unique COVID environment that we're in, and how it affects grain contracts. The good news, as we talked about in our ocean freight presentation, is most of the world ports, almost with the exception of India, almost all the world ports are open, operating normally. Business is busy, it's brisk, but everything seems to be flowing rather well, and that's the good news. We have had some destinations, such as China has requested in the past, has requested COVID-free documentation on some grain shipments, but there hasn't been any government, either in the United States or South America, who's been willing or able to offer a COVID-free certificate that would accompany grain shipments. So that seems to be, at least for now, dropped, a forgotten issue. What I want to emphasize, and I want to emphasize this very strongly, is it's very important that grain buyers read their contracts. Don't simply receive a contract from your shipper and your supplier and stick it in the filing cabinet. Read the contract and understand that the contract is made up of two important parts. The first part is that 1 or 2 page contract that will be written on the letterhead of your supplier. So if you purchase a grain cargo from a Cargill or an ADM or Gavilon or somebody else, they will issue you a sale contract to you on their letterhead, on their documentation. And it will be 1 or 2 pages long. And it will describe, it will outline the important features to that transaction. But somewhere in that contract, down probably in the bottom, in the remarks section, is going to be a notation of what underlying contract, what additional attachment contract applies to your agreement. Because in a 1 or 2 page document issued by your supplier, there simply isn't enough room or space to outline and describe all the little details that apply to a grain purchase and sale. So we have the main contract and the underlying contract, and they get married up. They get put together, and the two of them become the total agreement. And we're going to talk about those contracts as we move forward. The other thing to understand, and I mean truly think about, is that every contract describes the rights and the obligations of both the buyer and seller. So both parties have rights and both parties have obligations. Very important to remember, because many times buyers don't understand the limitations or the extent to which their obligations apply, and sometimes they don't understand all the rights that they possess within the contract. And in order to protect yourself, you need to be aware of your rights and your obligations. So negotiate whatever you desire. Whatever is mutually agreeable between the buyer and the seller is valid. If you want a pink ship, state it in your contract, and that's what must be applied. So any term, any condition on quality, on laboratory results, on shipment times, any detail you wish, everything is negotiable, as long as it becomes mutually agreeable between the two contracting parties. Now, just a moment ago, I mentioned underlying contracts. And there are different ways to purchase grain. You can purchase grain FOB, which of course means free on board a U.S. port on the west coast of the United States or out of the U.S. Gulf ports. And if you buy FOB, free on board, that means, of course, that the supplier is responsible for supplying the grain, and the buyer is responsible for supplying the ocean freight or the vessel. If you purchase FOB and charter your own vessel, the underlying contract that would apply to that transaction would be NAEGA, and NAEGA is the North American Export Grain Association. We simply call it NAEGA for the abbreviation for short, but the North American Export Grain Association out of Washington, D.C. And NAEGA has an FOB contract that is 3 or 4 pages long, and it covers all the details of an FOB transaction. The other way that you can purchase grain is delivered to your port in Chile. And if you buy grain delivered, you would use the term C and F, cost and freight, or you might use the term CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. So one simply carries the insurance on the cargo, and the first C and F example does not. But both those contracts are delivered to your port in Chile, which means the supplier is responsible to supply the grain and supply the vessel and deliver it to Chile or whatever country you happen to reside in. Excuse me. So we will be talking about FOB contracts and C&F delivered contracts. If you are buying FOB, that underlying contract most likely is what we call the NAEGA 2 contract, 2018. If you purchase delivered on a C&F type of contract, your underlying contract is going to be GAFTA, and GAFTA stands for the Grain and Feed Trade Association. The Grain and Feed Trade Association out of London, England. And GAFTA has about 130 different contracts that they govern, and it covers all types of commodities from all types of different origins and different destinations. And you have to pick the right GAFTA contract that applies to your type of shipment. So again, if you are doing a dry bulk shipment of 30 or 40 or 60,000 tons, it's most likely going to be GAFTA 24. Could be GAFTA number 30 if it's a partial cargo. And if you are contracting with containers, containerized shipments, you would most likely be using GAFTA contract number 88. There's also a term that we use for reference and reference only, and that is Inco Terms. And Inco stands for the International Chamber of Commerce. The International Chamber of Commerce Terms 2000. So you can go on your computer and you can type in Inco Terms 2000 and you will see the Inco definitions. They define what is the true definition of FOB, what is the accurate definition of C&F or CIF. So we use that for reference, but you won't see Inco written into a contract anywhere. It is simply for reference purposes. So as I just mentioned, the GAFTA, Grain and Feed Trade Association out of London, England, has about 130 contracts. And you pick the correct one, that it fits the origin and type of shipment that you are engaging in. Make sure that your supplier gives you a copy of NAEGA or GAFTA, the underlying contract that applies to your transaction. If they do not, you can go online to the NAEGA website and you can download a copy of the NAEGA 2 contract. You can do the same thing on the GAFTA website. Just go to the GAFTA website, click on the Contracts tab, and you can download copies of their contracts. They're detailed, but it's important to understand the details because they apply, legally apply to your transaction. We are going to talk about FOB very quickly. What is FOB? Well, we just mentioned it's free on board. Is it a delivery contract? No, it's free on board. If you supply the vessel and I have a sale to you, and let's pretend that that sale is for July, let's say June. We're approaching the month of June. Let's say it's for the month of June 1/15. So it's for the first half of June. What does that mean? Well, that legally means that I would be the seller and I have to get my cargo in place and ready to load your vessel within the first 15 days of June. You have the obligation to supply a vessel within the first 15 days of June. If you do that, the seller must accept your vessel and place it into the vessel loading lineup. So we have a contract that says shipment period June 1/15. You supply a vessel on June 13, and that vessel files at my grain elevator. Do I have to load your vessel? Do I have to give you a bill of lading within the next 2 days? Do I have to give you a loading bill of lading by June 15? The answer is no. I simply have to accept your vessel, put it into the lineup. So maybe your vessel is number 3 or number 4, and there are vessels already that have arrived in front of it. I simply have to put your vessel in the lineup, and under normal circumstances, load it in what we call normal rotation. So maybe your vessel does not come up to the berth until June 20. Well, then I would load it on June 20, probably give you a bill of lading that is maybe June 24 or June 25. And that would satisfy the requirements of the FOB contract. I use that example in comparison to GAFTA. GAFTA is a delivered contract. So if I sell you a contract for June 115 shipment delivered to your port in your country, then I must give you a bill of lading by the 15th day of June. Or I would be out of my contract obligations. I would not be meeting my contract obligations. So GAFTA, I would be obligated as the seller, I would be obligated to load your vessel by the 15th day of the month. So there's an important difference between, aside from just who supplies the vessel, and there's an important difference on how those two contracts under NAEGA or under GAFTA apply. We also use the terms, and we'll go over this quickly because I think we have some more critical issues to talk about. But if we're loading, if I am loading for you FOB, the United States, and you have supplied the vessel, then I have to give you a loading guarantee. How quickly will I load your vessel? Maybe I have in the contract that I will load your vessel within 5 days of its arrival and filing at the port and berth. And then you will see terms such as load guarantee, 5,000 tons per day, and then we'll use the words that are on the screen, WWD SHEX. We call that WWD checks or WWD Shink. There are all types of different acronyms, and these also apply for destination, because if I were to sell to you delivered to your port in your country, instead of a load guarantee, you would have to give me a unloading guarantee. You would have to guarantee me to discharge the vessel at your port in a certain amount of time. And we would use the same terms, WWD checks, WWD Shink, or whatever applies. Now, what does that mean? Well, WWD stands for weather working day. Weather working day, S means Sunday or Saturday, depending on how it's written. But in this case, we're talking about a load or a discharge rate that is guaranteed 5,000 metric tons per weather working day, Saturday PM, Sundays, holidays excluded. So the vessel time would not count for loading or unloading during Saturday afternoon, Sunday, or holidays during good weather conditions. The UU stands for unless used. Or you can have even if used. But I think the important thing for people to know is that we have this load rate or unload guarantee rate in the contracts, and weather working days are, rain time is excluded, holidays are excluded, and Saturdays or Sundays can be excluded depending on how the contract is written. But please remember, once you have used up your free time, there's another term that we commonly discuss, and that term is called once on demurrage, always on demurrage. So once you have used up your allotted time with good weather days, once you have exceeded your weather working days and you are now on demurrage, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter if it rains, it doesn't matter if a holiday occurs. Once on demurrage, always on demurrage. Demurrage calculations would go straight through. So remember that, please. Let's jump forward to another term. There is in that GAFTA contract a clause 11, and that clause 11 allows for an extension of shipment. Now, just to show you the difference, NAEGA on an FOB contract, there is no extension of shipment clause. Extensions of shipments, unless they're negotiated on a special reason, it does not apply to the contract under FOB NAEGA contracts. But GAFTA does have an extension of shipment. And if you read clause 11, it simply states that the seller can simply declare clause 11 at their desire, and they can obtain an automatic extension of shipment if they feel they need a little bit more time. And all they have to do is declare it prior to the end of the contract shipment period. So going back to our previous example, if I sold you June 1/15 shipment delivered to your country, C and F to your country for June 1/15, on the 13th or 14th of June, I could send you a message and simply state, I am going to declare GAFTA clause 11. And that would automatically give me a maximum of 8 additional days to ship, just because I declared that clause. The buyer doesn't get to say yes or no. The buyer has to accept that. So read clause 11 carefully and understand that it gives the seller the right for an extension of maximum 8 additional days, but no more. And if you read clause 11, you will see that it also stipulates that the buyer has the right to discount the seller's invoice by a prescribed percentage according to how many days were used to extend the contract, to extend the loading of the vessel. So I always tell buyers, I've had people ask me, oh, can the seller do this? And I say, yes, they can. But please don't forget, you have the right to discount the invoice. So if the buyer takes an extra 1 to 4 extra days, you can discount the contract by 1/2 of 1%. If the buyer takes 5 or 6 extra days after making this declaration, then you can discount the invoice by 1%. If the loading takes 7 or 8 extra days, you can discount the invoice by 1.5%. Under GAFTA 27, Clause 11. So I'm sure that the seller, when he sends you the invoice for your shipment, is going to send you an invoice for the full value. That would be rather natural. Please don't forget to tell your accounting department that if the seller has declared Clause 11 and has taken 5 or 6 or 7 extra days, please be sure to discount the invoice. That is your right. Otherwise, you're letting the seller get away free at no charge. I often get asked, well, what happens if the seller is more than 8 days delayed? What happens then? Well, the answer is everything is negotiable. There is no prescribed, preset discount. The seller would then have to come to the buyer and say, well, how much, let's negotiate. How much will you discount my invoice if I'm 9 days, 10 days, 12 days late? And you have to make a decision. First decision is, can you tolerate, can you accept the vessel being 12 or 13 days late? If you can, okay. And then negotiate the discount. Maybe you say it's going to be 2%. It's negotiable. But what is important, and what I will tell you numerous times during this presentation, is the importance of communication. We say communicate, communicate, communicate. Never just sit and be quiet. If a seller sends you a notification that they are going to declare NAEGA GAFTA Clause 11, tell them, okay, but you are going to reserve your rights to discount the invoice. If you get to day number 7 of that extension, send a message to the supplier and ask, will you be loading my vessel by tomorrow? Because your 8-day extension will have expired. Do not just sit quietly. And if the seller should respond, no, it's going to take me more than 1 or 2 more days, start the negotiation at that moment. Because even within the law, silence can sometimes be interpreted as acceptance. And you never want to be accepting something that you really don't wish to do. So never be silent. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Be on top of what's happening with your contract. Never let the seller say, well, I told the buyer I was going to be late. The buyer said nothing. I just assumed it was okay and I would be charged nothing. And don't allow that to happen. I'll mention quickly that if you are dealing with containerized shipments, of course, you would be using a different GAFTA contract. you would probably be using GAFTA 88. And GAFTA 88 also has an extension. It also has a clause 11, but that clause reads differently than it does in GAFTA number 27. That clause allows up to a 14-day maximum extension of time. And it has a different schedule of discounts that can be applied against the invoice. So read your contract, understand the clauses, understand your rights under these clauses. There is also under GAFTA, and we don't have time today to go all the way through it because it can be rather complicated, but there's also a clause 12, which is appropriation. And you should read that to understand your rights and obligations to declare a shipper in default. If they do not ship in time, you would have to be careful and well read about clauses 11 and clause 12. Let's move on to something that might be a little more a little easier to understand, and that is what happens, and particularly since we're talking about this COVID environment, but these issues of force majeure that we're about to talk about apply to both NAEGA and GAFTA contracts, and they apply whether it's COVID related or weather related. And it's important to know the definition and the rights and the obligations that apply to each contract. If we are talking about FOB contracts under NAEGA, North American Export Grain Association, there is no force majeure clause. Under NAEGA FOB contracts, force majeure does not exist. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. NAEGA, by design, has a clause 20. And clause 20 is the inability to ship clause. Read that and understand that how that applies to your FOB contract. And what I like about NAEGA not having force majeure, having a clause 20, is that NAEGA requires the seller to apply for a certificate to prove that they indeed had the complete inability to execute their contract. GAFTA does not have that. So we're going to look at a couple of things. Let's start with GAFTA and delivered contracts, because I think that might be the more common contract for most buyers. And GAFTA has a clause 21, and that is the prevention of shipment. It is the force majeure clause. And I think we all know that force majeure is described as the act of God clause. In other words, something terrible has happened. Something has happened that has caused the seller not to be able to execute the contract. And these are a few of the listed reasons where force majeure might be valid. You'll see them listed here, from prohibition by the government, blockade, acts of terrorism, strikes and lockouts, riots, which means civil unrest, other things here, fire, hurricanes, terrible weather. But I want to emphasize, and you have to think about this carefully, I want to emphasize that force majeure is the complete inability to load, the complete inability of the seller to execute their contract because something has happened beyond their control. Beyond their control. It cannot be company, it cannot be shipper caused. The shipper cannot have any involvement in what caused the inability to ship. In the United States, we had a case a few years back that the seller had a union dispute, a labor dispute with union employees, and they had a lockout at their loading facility. And they tried to declare force majeure because the employees were not coming to work. But that was ruled to be an invalid reason because the elevator company had locked out the employees. So they had had a hand in causing the problem. So the problem cannot have any related input or involvement of the company declaring such. NAEGA, as I mentioned, has a clause 20. If a shipper declares clause 20 on an FOB contract where NAEGA is concerned, then the shipper must declare clause 20 to the buyer, must send them notification, and should apply to NAEGA for a clause 20 certificate confirming the validity of that declaration. So you cannot just declare clause 20 under NAEGA and say, okay, that's it. You apply for a certificate confirming the validity. And NAEGA appoints a committee, a small group of people, to investigate what happened and decide if a certificate should be issued or not. So if a shipper should declare clause 20 and tell you they cannot ship, they cannot load your vessel on an FOB contract, then you should respond by asking, please show me your NAEGA clause 20 certificate. It's also important to understand, I don't have an official statistic, but I happen to know that something close to 90% of the applications for a NAEGA clause 20 certificate are denied. Only a small percentage are approved. So it's important to understand, just because my shipper, just because the supplier declared NAEGA clause 20, is it truly valid or not? And again, under clause 20, it can be embargoes, bad weather, strikes, labor problems, as long as the labor problem was not caused by the shipper. And there are other reasons that NAEGA will investigate to see if it is appropriate to issue a confirming certificate. The other thing that's important to know both about NAEGA Clause 20 and also about force majeure under GAFTA. Please read the bottom line, the bottom two lines of this slide. One, it must be the complete inability to ship. And it must not involve just financial hardship. It must not just involve financial difficulty. It must be, under both contracts, the complete inability to ship. Now, I say that, and I emphasize that, because we have seen shippers say, the Mississippi River in the United States, the Mississippi River is frozen, or the Mississippi River has a low water, or there is a blockage in the river. So, as a shipper, I will declare Clause 20. Or on a GAFTA contract, I will declare force majeure, Clause 21. Is that valid? Well, in the case of the United States, no, it's not valid. And we ask the question, why not? And the answer is because that does not constitute, that does not create the complete inability to ship. Exporters in the United States have alternatives. They could ship by rail. They could ship from the Midwest of the United States to the port by rail. Anytime that there is a difficulty in loading or receiving barges, we can substitute and ship by rail. Aha. But the seller will tell you, oh, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. It's more expensive. It's more expensive to ship grain to the port by rail than by barge. And since I cannot get barges, I would like to declare force majeure. It's not valid. It is not the complete inability to execute the contract. There are alternatives. Even though those alternatives are more expensive, they still exist. So that's one very good example of why force majeure or Clause 20 declaration would not be valid, providing there was another means to execute the contract, because financial difficulty, financial hardship is not a good reason. It is not a valid reason. And we have seen many sellers try to get out of contracts anytime there is financial difficulty involved. So be careful of that. And understand that all of these contracts, both NAEGA and GAFTA, speak to the inability of the seller to ship. They speak to the ability of the seller to declare Clause 20 or force majeure, but they do not speak to the inability of the buyer to declare a force majeure or an inability to receive the grain. So we have to be careful about that. There are many things, and I'll put them, and I think that US Wheat will send you a copy of this PowerPoint, and as you later, if you wish, thumb through it, you'll see some other considerations that buyers should think about if the seller says, I cannot ship. Again, when we talk about the complete inability to ship, let's pretend like there was, let's pretend like there was a serious problem in the US Gulf. A hurricane occurred and caused the inability to load vessels. If you had an FOB contract, that could potentially be valid reason for a seller to declare clause 20. But at the same time, it may not be a valid reason for a seller to declare force majeure on a C&F contract. Why is that? Because C&F is delivered. It does not have to be shipped from New Orleans. It could be shipped from other ports. It could be shipped from Texas. It could be shipped from the Atlantic. It could be shipped from the Pacific, the West Coast of the United States. Yes, it would be more expensive to ship from other points, but it would not be impossible. So this is where you have to compare the differences between an FOB contract and a C&F delivered contract. So is your seller just looking for an excuse not to ship on time because of financial difficulty, financial hardship? Or is there a truly valid reason for the seller to declare force majeure or a clause 20 event? And the other thing, when we talk, particularly today, in today's environment, when we talk about COVID, when we go back and we examine NAEGA clause 20, and we examine GAFTA force majeure under clause 21, keep in mind that it must be the complete inability to execute the contract. It must not involve just financial difficulty alone. And it must be something unforeseen. It must be something that could not have been predicted. And when COVID first, so to speak, arrived, when it first became an issue almost a year and a half ago, it was unexpected. And labor, people could have gotten infected and gotten sick. And that could have caused ports and loading facilities to have unexpected problems. But today, COVID is well known. COVID is something that must be expected. And therefore, it's not a valid excuse. It's not a valid reason for not executing a contract. It's something that today is predictable. It is something today that we know could potentially happen. So there are differences here. And again, you have to keep in mind that a seller must have some event that's unexpected, unpredictable, and creates the true inability not to be able to execute the contract. Many, many things to think about, many things to consider. So again, communicate, communicate, communicate. If your seller declares the inability to ship, if the seller says, I need an extension of time, you have to ask, first of all, is that allowed in my contract? Secondly, if it is allowed in the contract, how much am I allowed to discount the invoice? Or is this something that we should negotiate because it's not applicable to the contract? And I am not going to sit quiet and just accept that without thinking, is this a valid declaration? Does the seller truly have the complete inability to ship? Think about it carefully. I have, over the last, well, many years, not just the last year or two, been involved with many types of shipments with sellers said I could not ship, and we communicated back to the seller and found that the seller was just trying to, if you will, get away with something for their own convenience. But they did not necessarily have a right to do such within the contract. So sellers and buyers have to understand the contract rights and the contract obligations. And don't be silent, because again, silence can sometimes be interpreted as acceptance. Always respond to sellers' emails or text. So, resources, you can go online, you can type in NAEGA, N-A-E-G-A, NAEGA 2, and you can download a copy of the contract. You can go to GAFTA, G-A-F-T-A, and on their website, you can download and print out copies of their contracts, the ones that would be appropriate in whatever you have agreed to with your supplier. You can also look at Inco, as I mentioned earlier, the International Chamber of Commerce, Inco Terms 2000, and you can look at the definitions there. And then for other information, you can go to the International Grain Trade or the International Grains Council, and they also have resource information for you. If you have difficulty, if you have something, a problem with your supplier, first and foremost, always try to negotiate through a disagreement. Always, always try to negotiate through a problem. However, if you cannot successfully negotiate and come to a resolution on a problem, you have the ability to arbitrate. NAEGA has a NAEGA arbitration. GAFTA administers their own arbitration. And if necessary, you have the right to go to arbitration and allow arbitrators to decide who is right and who is wrong in settling a dispute. So understand that you have that ability if necessary. But again, I want to emphasize strongly, communicate, communicate, communicate. I am an arbitrator under NAEGA. I have been involved in many, many arbitrations over the last 35 years under both NAEGA, and been an advisor to companies in GAFTA arbitrations. And the most important thing to realize is the arbitrator was not present. The arbitrator or the arbitration panel was never involved in any of your phone calls, was never involved in the writing of your contract, was never involved in any of your text messages. So document, document, document. As I talk to other arbitrators, we often all witness the same problem. The biggest problem is people don't communicate back and forth very well. Often in an arbitration, often in a dispute, we'll ask ourselves as arbitrators, why did these two parties not communicate better? Why did these two parties not talk back and forth more? If they had simply communicated better, they would not have this problem. Or if they had documented their communications better, it would better serve the case they are trying to make in the dispute. So communicate, document, so that it never becomes just one party saying, well, I think I should be able to do this, but I don't have any written proof. Or I think the other party told me this, but I don't have any written proof. That is your biggest problem. Please communicate. This is just the top copy of the NAEGA contract. This is the International Center for Dispute Resolution, which is used to administer NAEGA arbitrations. And you can find their terms and conditions also on the website. This is a copy of GAFTA 27, just the top of the first page, but it tells you what you are looking for if you go online. And that is for a dry bulk shipment delivered to your port, your berth. There's also a FOSFA, F-O-S-F-A contract. In wheat, you would not use this. In corn or soybeans, you would not necessarily use this. But if you ever run across FOSFA, it is the fats and Oilseeds Trade Association out of London, England, and it deals with commodities like soybean meal, oilseeds and meal, different byproducts mostly. Well, that's what I wanted in the short hour that we have to go over contract terms and conditions. Those are the terms I thought would be most important, excuse me, in today's environment to highlight as to what's important to grain buyers, to people buying wheat from the United States, either FOB or delivered to your port. But again, I strongly advise you to get the NAEGA contract, get a copy of GAFTA, read through it. Yes, it may help put you to sleep at night. There's a lot of little print and terms and conditions, but it's important to understand your rights and your obligations so that when a situation comes up, you know how to react. You know and you understand what you have to accept and what you do not have to accept. So with that, I will conclude my formal presentation and turn it back to Osvaldo and your question and answer period if you have any questions on any topic. I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope this has been a little bit helpful to helping you manage your contracts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. Muchas gracias, Jay, por tu excelente presentación.
Thank you, Jay, for your excellent presentation. Very, very useful, of course, for all buyers in South America, in Brazil, etc. You can ask your questions in Portuguese, Spanish, or English. You can ask your questions now, or maybe you want to wait until the end of the next presentation.
Please unmute your microphones if you want to ask questions. In the meantime, I'm going to share my presentation. Please feel free to ask any questions in the meantime. Osvaldo, I see that Mr. Calderon wants to add something. Thank you. Can you hear me, Osvaldo? Well, from Colombia, I have the following question. How do you deal with discrepancies in kernel quality detected after they land in the destination? The speaker spoke about arbitration, but oftentimes this is way too late to settle any issues. So in the US or wherever the origin of the grain is. Thank you. This is my question.
Thank you. It's a very good question because it also is a very common question. We get that question quite often all around the world on many different commodities. I hate to say the answer is simple because actually it might be, and that is, and don't shoot me because I'm just telling you how the contract law reads. But again, read your contract, and what you will find 99.9% of the time, you will find that sellers execute their contracts, sellers negotiate their contracts, and it will have a term say loading weights and grades. Loading weight and loading quality to govern at loading. So 99.9% of the time, the contract term stipulates loading quality to govern the contract. And that is then, the seller will then supply you, the buyer, with a FGS or other appropriate quality certificate proving that they loaded the quality they were supposed to load in accordance with the contract terms and conditions. Now, I think what you're asking is what happens when that vessel arrives at another port at destination and the buyer says, wait a minute, I don't think I received the quality I purchased. Well, the seller will say, no, we sold that contract based on loading quality and loading weight, and that's what you have to accept. And from a legal standpoint, the seller is correct. If the contract calls for loading weight and loading quality, then that applies. And in legal terms, it does not matter what the buyer thinks they received at the destination port. Now, the next question that will come to your mind, and many, many other people, is, well, wait a minute, what can I do about that? Well, I think there's two things you can do about that. One, you can negotiate, you can try to negotiate a destination quality on your contract. But your seller probably won't like that. Your seller probably won't agree to that. And that's again why 99.9% of contracts are written on origin, loading, quality, and weight. But you can try to negotiate it. When I was trading, I would tell people, and this is my personal opinion, I cannot speak for your suppliers, but I would tell people you can have loading, weight, and grade, or I can sell you destination quality. But in order to sell you destination quality, I have to go out and purchase insurance to cover my risk. That insurance is called FOG insurance. And FOG stands for Free Outturn Grade. And that insurance, back when commodities were less expensive than they are today, that insurance policy would cost me about $25 a ton. So then I would tell the buyer, do you want to buy a standard contract on loading weight and loading grade at, let's just make up a price, $300 a ton, or do you want to buy destination quality at $25 a ton higher? And that always resulted in the obvious answer. The buyer would say, no, I don't want to pay that much more money. Let's go with the standard contract. So that is one option that the buyer has. The other option is the one that Osvaldo is about to give you on his next presentation. And I think that's going to be very important for you to watch and listen to carefully, because the other best situation to protect yourself on quality is to follow what Osvaldo is going to talk about in his next presentation, when he talks about loading rates and loading quality under Cusum. So I would just advise you pay close attention to that coming up next.
Muchas gracias, Jay, por tu excelente respuesta.
Thank you, Jay, for your excellent answer. We have interpretation services into English. That's why I'm addressing to you in Spanish. So up next, we are going to talk about wheat purchase from the US. Oftentimes we get a wheat that does not meet the quality that you are requesting, but the contract was executed. I'm going to explain in further detail about that. I'll try and answer the question that Carlos Gutierrez from Bolivia put, which says that how do we cover to avoid weight difference from origin to destination? Of course, weight is one of the characteristics that we all want to have met, but your question was answered with what Jay has said. Therefore, we're going to make sure there's not any other question, and I will make then a presentation on well, I'm going to tackle here the topic on one of the purchase formats available. I'm going to talk about the average Cusum versus average and Dockage contract. And in the off-grade specification, I'm going to talk and dwell on Dockage. I like to start, regardless of the topic of the presentation, with an overview of the 6 wheat classes in the US. So what are we buying? What's the origin of what I'm buying, of the commodities where I'm buying? The green points are the hard red winter that is grown in the center, at the very heart of the US. So hard red spring is grown in center north in the US and is brought down the Mississippi River and is shipped on the Gulf. This class, soft white and hard white, with the soft white that you can see, I'm pointing here, the light blue points, is produced in the US Northwest. The soft red winter is grown in the southeastern region of the United States and is shipped out of the Gulf ports. And the durum for pasta production is grown in northern US. Once having seen the overview, we're going to start with the limit specification that the buyer can specify and detail in the purchase contract. It's important to know that each contract depends on its requirements, the buyer's requirements, not what a trader can offer you, but what your requirements are. If you want your wheat to be shipped on a pink ship, you have to put it in the contract. But this has pros and cons that we'll see next. In the purchase contract, buyer can demand many things, can demand and specify a specific wheat weight or a specific protein or grade. So this is the example of a higher test or specific weight requirements that can improve yield and milling, increase extraction rates. So I can specify it, spell it out in the contract and pay a premium for it. In the case of a specific weight, there is an obvious financial return and yield in milling. Very common is also higher wheat protein requirement that can also, depending on the end product, improve its functional quality. For example, if it's for bread making. As I was telling you, this can cost more, basically, because there are more quality requirements that require more segregation and more processing by the seller, which means that it will be more time consuming for the exporters. It'll have to segregate, and shipment take longer because more sublots are rejected because some sublots may not meet the requirements.
Osvaldo? Osvaldo? Please excuse me. I do not see your face or your presentation on the screen. Is your camera on?
Claudia, no se ve mi presentación. Claudia, María Fernanda.
Claudia, Maria Fernanda, can you please assist me here? Apparently the camera is off, but the presentation is being shared. Thank you, Dario. Can you see my presentation in full screen?
No, I don't see your face or your presentation, but maybe it's me. If
Quizás
the
el problema,
that's okay.
Well, I'm receiving feedbacks, Jay, that they are able to see my presentation.
Okay,
And well, when I finish, I will put my camera on again, but the presentation, I understand that they can see it. They can see my presentation.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make
No.
sure if it's just me, that's okay. I wanted to make sure everybody could see. Thank you.
On the contrary, thank you, Jay, for your comments and for your interruption. Si alguien no puede ver mi presentación, por favor.
So if you are having difficulty in viewing my presentation, please let me know. Thank you so much. So we are on limit specifications. I have good piece of news here. I was telling you that the more requirements, there's more cost association. The good news is that there is the Federal Grain Inspection Service, FGIS, that is always concerned about working for you. FGIS is your friend, your partner in the US, so to speak. Number one, it enforces the meeting of the contract. Each sublot is assessed by and inspected by FGIS. Each sublot can weigh up to 1,600 metric ton, depending on ship size. Oftentimes, we talk about sublots of 1,600 metric tons, and each sublot is inspected by the FGIS. Once approved by the FGIS, your sublot is shipped on the and is loaded. So you must demand your seller because this is delivered by default. There's free of charge. This is an example of a 35,000 tons with 23 sublots. There's going to be 23 sublots inspected by the FGIS. Therefore, let us start by the contract formats, the three ways of buying. We have the average one, the Cusum, and minimum and maximum per sublot. So the average one, I apologize, the average one spells out that the requirements you might have, in this case, for instance, a minimum protein of 13%. So the weighted average of sublots must be equal to or greater than 13%. What must be included in the contract is the weighted average of sublots must be equal to or greater than 13%. Maximum of 13% protein.
Or more. Why do I say more? Because in this case, when you say 13% or higher, you're actually punishing the seller, not the buyer. You must always set the superior value. The seller can load more protein because, let's say, he is allowed to do so in the contract. As Jay said, if we say 13% minimum or above, at a specific moment, the seller, if they have or if they're able to load a little bit more than 13% for whatever reason, they will do it because they are allowed by us to do so. And of course, it is important for us to have a wheat of this quality protein. If I'm not interested in that, this is not necessary, of course. Normally, buyers specify average. They are looking for price. So let's begin with an example of a wheat purchase. This could be a full ship or a mill purchase. Let's say they purchased a total of 10 sublots that are shown on the slide. We have right here on top the requirement that is protein average. I hope you can see here sublot number 1. Remember, the FGIS analyzes all the sublots. The first one is loaded with 12.5 protein content, so the average is 12.5. So far, it's not important that it's below 13, because what's important is the weighted average, this final figure over here. So we continue. The second sublot was loaded at 12.2. The average between first and second is 12.4. 12.35, 12.4. Next sublot, number 3, was loaded at 11.3 protein. The average is 12. As you can see, the average is quite far from the buyer's requirement. But in this case, this is not important. The seller can do it because what's important is this last figure. Sublot number 5 increased a little bit, 14.2, to be able to somehow follow the average. Number 6, 11.5, and so forth. Number 9 was loaded at 12.1, and in this case, we are below this average. So they must, in this last sublot, load at 14.3. This is also not very important or very interesting for the seller, because they want to have homogeneous loads. 13% wheat would be expensive and they would be losing money, but they must do it to meet these requirements. So if we want to have the average of this specific mill, in this case with 10 sublots, we have 12.95 is approximates to 13. So it rounds up to 13. It's just like in school, remember, when you had grades? Hopefully, with this grade, you could go up to 13. This is the average purchase method. Normally, then, the average specifications have the lower prices because, of course, they speed up the loading of the ship. There are very few sublots that are rejected, only if the final certificate is below 13% would the sublot be rejected. Now, with the Cusum method, let's look at a minimum or maximum per sublot. This is called Cusum, or cumulative sum, because there is a breakpoint or an error margin of 0.5%. So let's look at the example here. Let's continue with protein. Minimum level protein, 13%. This is what the buyer wants. So Cusum vessel loading plan basically limits the variability of the sublots with a maximum tolerance of 0.5%, and this margin of error can vary. The weighted average of each sublot must be equal to or greater than 13. So basically, these buyers are focused on quality and in the good ratio between quality and price. This is what these buyers want. They want a homogeneous quality. Homogeneous is synonymous to benefits, of course, gains. Let's look at an example of the same purchase made by a mill with a minimum of 12% protein, in this case with Cusum method. So we begin, we see that our requirement is minimum protein 13%. We have a breakpoint, margin of error of 0.5. The seller cannot go beyond that. And we have a starting value of minus 0.2. What does this mean? This is an advantage for the buyer. So it's not to begin at 0.0 to help the buyer. This is a benefit for the buyer. You begin the arithmetics with minus 0.2 so that there is less variability on the seller side. So here we have a sublot number 1 at 13. We begin with minus 0.2. Sublot number 2, 12.9. This is minus 0.3. Sublot 3 was loaded at 12.9 again, and we see that it goes to 0.04. We're getting close to 0.5. So the fourth sublot is loaded at 13.2. And here again, we have a cumulative sum of minus 0.2. Fifth sublot, again at 13.2, and this takes us to 0. And here I would like to sublot number 6 is loaded at 13.2 again, but it's not added. Arithmetically, it should be 0.2 positive, but again, to the advantage of the buyer, it is not added. So the seller does not have any gain if they load more protein content. So again, more protein content was loaded, but it is not added. It's only deducted. Sublot 7 was loaded at 12.7, and this takes us to minus 0.3. Sublot 8 was charged at 12.7, and this takes us to a cumulative sum of minus 0.6. What happens here? FGIS sets an alarm and says this sublot cannot be loaded because it's out of the breakpoint. There are two possibilities. The seller can request a new inspection or to simply go back to the grain elevators. Now a new inspection was requested, and it gave us 12.6. The average between these two figures is 12.65 or 12.7 rounded up. So we go back to minus 0.6, and this is not accepted. The FGIS office does not allow the loading, and this sample is eliminated. So you can see from sublot 7, this one is not numbered, and they go directly to sublot 8, which is loaded at 13. Another benefit for the buyer. Why do we begin with minus 0.5 and not the last figure here? Basically, this is to punish the seller. Every time the seller requests a new analysis or a review of a sublot, he is punished or by stating at minus 0.5. This is always the way it is. So we have three benefits here for the buyer, right? You begin, then you do not add, and every time the seller does not follow the requirements, everything starts again at minus 0.5. Sublot 9 is 13.2, and the last one is at 12.8, so it ends at minus 0.5 within the range. What happens here? The total average was 13.01, 13%, so it follows what was requested by the buyer. What happens here? Well, you can see the previous load and this one. There is a much higher level of homogeneity. And this, of course, means greater gains. So as you saw in Jay's presentation, the ships are bigger and bigger all the time. Therefore, there is a greater possibility and probability to have purchasing pools of small and medium-sized mills. So this Cusum method is very, very important. And the marginal expense versus its benefit is really worth analyzing every time you make a purchase. You will be surprised because the premium from going from average to minimum level, in this case with Cusum, many times it's not that much. It depends on the moment, it depends on your demand, it depends on how you are dealing, but you should never avoid getting quotes with this Cusum method. This is something I would like to emphasize. There is another one that is called, in this case, we have minimum or maximum sublots depending on your needs. This is absolute terms. This is much more restrictive for the seller. It's more beneficial for the buyer. So here we have the same example, same purchase, level of protein in this case. No sublot should be below 13%. There is an absolute limit, no accumulated sums. There is no margin of error. The margin of error is 0. Weighted average of sublots must be equal or greater than 13%. Here, the buyers are really focusing on quality. Breakpoint is 0. There is no margin of error. Of course, there will be a higher cost, but you will receive wheat that is totally homogeneous. Why does it have more higher cost? Basically, the seller will have to be very, very careful and invest a lot of time in not having the sublots rejected, in mixing the wheat so that it meets the specifications, and it could be a slower operation. Here we have an example of level of protein with no sublot below 13%. As you can see here, again, our requirement is 13%, breakpoint or margin of error is 0, and starting value is 0. So here, Cusum is not applied. Very simple. This exercise, sublot number 1 is 13, sublot 2 is 13.1. Again, this is beneficial for the buyer. For the buyer, no points are added here. So the seller could load 14 if he wanted, and this would still be 0 for the benefit of the buyer. Sublot number 3 is 12.9. So this goes to minus 0.1, and it's not accepted. FGIS says this sublot cannot be loaded. You can analyze it again or return it. In this case, the seller analyzes it again. Here it has 13% protein, and the average between these two figures is 13. So the result is 0, and in this case, the load is accepted. Number 4 is 13.2. Again, this goes to 0, regardless of how high this figure is, and so forth. in number 8, you see that the seller loads at 14.8, which was not necessary, but somehow he also has the right to see the result and retrieve or this sublot. Here it says elevator return sublot 8 to the house, meaning that the seller said, hey, wait a minute, this is too high. I have a financial cost here, so I have the right to return it. So we have a new sublot number 8 at 13.2, etc. So you can see here that regardless of the total average 13, each sublot is extremely homogeneous. So normally the specification per sublot has a higher price. But again, I would suggest that you always get quotes for this. The mixtures are done more carefully, of course. There's a higher rejection of sublots, and of course, the shipping time could be higher, or the loading time should be higher. It's very common to use Cusum method in South America. Sometimes the premium to go to Cusum is not that high, it's very low, and the returns are very beneficial, the financial returns. According to, or the questions that were made before, the way to assure or guarantee that a purchasing pool of several mills, whatever number, that buy together to have minimum volumes, it is indispensable that they buy with Cusum method for each one of the mill to receive homogeneous wheat. Otherwise, what Don Tirso said, you buy average, the trader buys average because it's beneficial for him, and the first people that receive the wheat, it's good quality, but the last loads probably are much or have worse characteristics, but the purchase contract was applied. And this is what Jay said, it's difficult because you go to the trader and the trader says, hey, the contract was applied, but the way it was subdivided amongst the mills varies a lot. And this also happens even if it's just one mill. The mill receives the trucks. One truck has one characteristic, the next truck has a different characteristic, and this generates a loss. It generates more work, etc. And this can be solved with the Cusum method. Let's go then to some off-grade factors. Amongst the off-grade factors, we're looking at dockage here. We also see some examples of off-grade factors that are normally happen in South America, class and subclass. Of course, it's indispensable to have these classes and subclasses in order to be able to offer a specific product. In terms of protein, you see that the moisture is important, the level of mycotoxins. The DON level is extremely important, and it's very common in South America. And now I would like to talk about moisture. Moisture is extremely important to have it very clear that moisture has a direct relationship with the financial return. The lower the moisture, the higher the return. Normally, the purchase specifications are minimum 13.5 moisture, ignoring the value that is generated by low moisture wheat. The lower the moisture content, you deliver more value to the mill. Also, moisture that above 13.5 may take to storage infections and storage problems. So it's very important to know that the level of moisture of the wheat is a very competitive factor when you make a decision. And also heavy metals. Many countries have maximum levels of heavy metals like cadmium. And in the case of Colombia, for example, they are very demanding in this regard. One of the factors, or the off-grade factors also, is dockage. Dockage, let's remember, all the quality analyses that are done by FGIS are without dockage. So they do not consider dockage, and then they go to the analysis. Let's begin with a definition of dockage. It's any matter that is not wheat, that can be eliminated easily through sieves or any other cleaning devices. This means seeds, grains of other kinds, etc.
So the US defines dockage as whatever is not wheat kernel. Typically, dockage is quite different from the wheat kernel as to weight and shape, and is easily removed by the mill's cleaning system. And there's foreign material. It is the second cleaning of the wheat. Dockage is the first cleaning, and the foreign material the second cleaning. So what is normal in South American purchase contract? It specifies 1.0% dockage, even less. Let's see next, how less? It all depends on the buyer. So when this is clear, let's see how to manage dockage. So, first case, the case docket value is positive or neutral. This is an example. In my country, a destination, if markets where dockage has a positive commercial value, the specifications can deduct from invoiced amount of wheat purchased, but the average dockage content is high, maximum 1.0%, and must be deducted from amount invoiced. 1.0% dockage. So I can deduct from, is deductible therefore, from amount invoiced. In this case, the buyer, if it specifies dockage, establishes an achievable limit by the seller of wheat. But freight, transportation, and cleaning cost must also be taken into account. Important to mention here is the dockage deductible from total amount is quite common in the South America, and you know it. But those of you who do not apply it, bear in mind that you can do it. Therefore, we have a dockage deductible in markets where dockage has positive or neutral value of a maximum of 1% dockage. What happens in this case in markets where dockage has no commercial value? So, a maximum caps are closer to the harvest average of the wheat class that is bought. Hard red wind spring is 0.8% dockage, hard red winter 0.7% dockage, soft red winter 0.9%, soft winter 0.7% dockage. a little higher of maximum level because it's close to Gulf ports. That's why it's very important to get dockage information in the quality reports and have it very clear what are the average dockage levels in each one of the harvests. Thus, we can request and specify a dockage maximum that is not easy, that is easy to manage. In markets where dockage has no commercial value or negative commercial value, the specifications can establish maximum caps and we are probably thinking about buying from the Pacific Northwest of Great Lakes rather than the ports in the Atlantic to reduce dockage content. I give here examples of 0.3% dockage that is quite demanding, but depending on the buyer, this is also deductible, always deductible, but sublots up to 0.3%, and each one of the sublots must have that dockage content. We can also demand minimum and maximum of dockage. And this is the negative commercial value of dockage. And it is all deductible. In this case, to summarize, we have to create value for our company. In quality specifications are meant to optimize the value of wheat. Therefore, we have to know what grades create value for your company or for the market. Some requirements are not paid with a premium price. Let's see what creates value for us. So there is this possibility of getting minimum of maximum per sublot of dockage contest. Get in touch with your region's U.S. wheat office and talk to your supplier. We also insist on you to take advantage of the official inspection by the FGIS. This is an inspection, federal agency that is free of charge. Whenever you can, take advantage of their excellent service to have more specification and compliance. So from crop to crop, wheats are different. That's why we hold so many wheat seminars to specify the limits and the dockage levels of each harvest and each crop year, because the characteristics vary. So we have to make contracts that are easy for the buyer, but also for the seller. It's very important to know how crops are going from year to year. The relationship between provider and buyer must be very close. They have to know what is important for one party or for the other party. Knowledge is power. Customers who know U.S. wheat quality assurance system well are very seldom disappointed with the quality of the wheat they buy. And we're always willing to help. We are based in Santiago, Chile. Thank you so much for your attention. And now, we're going to open the floor in this Q&A session. You can ask your questions in Spanish, in English, or Portuguese. Let's see what's on the chat. Thank you.
No, no hay preguntas. También pueden escribirlas en el chat si
Well,
quieren.
you can also ask in writing on the chat. So let us declare then this seminar closed. Thank you so much for the excellent attendance we got. Especially, thank you so much to Mr. Howard J. O'Neill for his excellent presentations, insightful presentation, knowledge, and his willingness to entertain all the questions. Thank you also to the interpreters. Thank you, Alexis, too, the interpreters, too, who have fared so well, so professionally. And I'd like to remind you that presentations are available and will be sent to you, translated into Portuguese and Spanish. Thank you all on behalf of the U.S. Wheat office in Santiago, Chile, for the excellent attendance. We are always open to suggestions that may help us provide better services in our information, our consulting services, and whatever you need. We are here to listen to your questions. We hope these 4 presentations have been useful to you, and I'll give you a big hug. Jay, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure listening to you again. Thank you all. So enjoy the evening. See you soon.